Whenever we think about multiplayer games, we usually think of MMOs, FPS, or other similar games where you end up face to face with other players in real time. Real-time multiplayer games are cool and also have a lot of advantages, but asynchronous multiplayer games can also offer a good experience. In my last video, I showed how I learned the basic of web dev and made a basic real-time multiplayer game. In this video, I will be using what I learned, but this time instead to make an asynchronous multiplayer game. I started by getting free sprites online to have at least a good start for the look of my game. And I made a basic code to spawn players and show health bars. Then I wanted to create spells. Usually I do that in Unity or Unreal using the particle systems. However, this JavaScript engine doesn't have any particle system. Thankfully, I had a genius idea to make my particle systems in Unity and then use a script to take screenshots a few times per second and save them to a file, so I can then import them in my game as a sprite animation. This worked surprisingly well. The only downside is that the animation is always going to be the same, unlike the particle systems which usually have some form of randomness, but that's okay. Next, I decided to work a bit on the main menu. The design is definitely not final, but it's a good start. I made it so as you win fights, you gain XP and level up. When you level up, you gain stat points and then you can spend those points to increase your stats. That's pretty cool. But at this point, you might be wondering, how is that a multiplayer game? And you're absolutely right, it's not a multiplayer game at all, so let's make it one. I first had to make the register and login system so I can differentiate different player accounts. And I also had to make a token system to make it so you don't have to re-log in every time you go on the site. Obviously right now there aren't a lot of data in the database, but I still thought it would be good to prepare in case there is one day a lot of data, so instead of using a text file like I did before, I installed and used SQLite, which allowed me to have a database using SQL, which is a lot better at dealing with huge amount of data. The database stores your username, password, and token. Your token is also saved in your browser, so it can be loaded and sent back to the server every time you go on the site. And so this makes you log in without having to enter your username or password. The password right now is not encrypted, but if I ever make this game public, I will of course have to encrypt them. Otherwise, if there is somehow a database leak, everyone will get all of your passwords, and obviously no one wants that. I also made a database for the player data, like the levels and the stats, which are linked to the ID of the user, so when you log in with your token or username, the server can get the data linked with your ID and send it back to you so you can display it on the main menu or anything else. Now, to make it a multiplayer game, I simply have to add to the main menu a list of other players' datas stored on the server and let you fight them. This way you can fight other players' characters while they are away, and they can also fight yours. I also didn't want people to be able to somehow cheat the fights, so I didn't want to let the fights happen on the client side like it was up to now, so I changed it to calculate the fight on the server, log every action, and then replicate it on the client step by step. This way, even if the player somehow tries cheating by editing the variables or has a bug in his game, the result is already determined by the server before the fight even starts on your screen. By that point, I felt like it was time to work on the combat, so I started by adding a beam attack. Once again by screenshotting a Unity particle system. I made it so that attack has a 2-round cooldown, and I made each player use the first spell in their list that isn't on cooldown. So you use your first spell, then if it's on cooldown you use the second, if the second is on cooldown too you use the third. So this game becomes a sort of auto-battler. Now you might be wondering, why not let the player choose which spell to use? And that's simple, because you fight other players while they are away, you don't fight them in real time, so they cannot choose. So because the spells are all used in a predictable order, the game becomes a strategy game rather than a reaction game. No player can react to what the other player is doing, so you have to set up your spell with a good strategy so they work well together, and try to predict the outcome of the fight before even starting it. Later, I'll let the players move around the order of their spells so they can choose which one will happen in what order, and this will be the base of the strategy. But before that, even though my player was much higher level than the enemies and had much higher stats, I still did and took as much damage as the enemy. And that's because the stats were not implemented yet. So I made it so strength increases your damage and defense reduces the damage you take. I also made it so having a higher speed than your enemy will allow you to make the first move. And later I might make it so the speed stat increases your chances to dodge, but I didn't do the dodge yet. An RPG game is not complete without some form of buffs or debuffs, so I added that next and used it to make many spells that boost your strength, defense, or apply a damage over time to the enemy. By then, the player had a lot of spells but no way of changing the order, so the battle was extremely predictable and everyone had the same order, which makes it boring and kind of pointless. So the last thing I had to do to make this a kind of playable game was to make it so you can move your spells around. By using a good spell order against an enemy, even if they are higher level, you can win. I also added a display for the spells in their order with a cooldown display so you can follow the fight a bit better. And there you go, the base of my first async multiplayer game is done. Now I can talk about why an async multiplayer game is so cool. First, the most important one in my opinion, is how the active player count doesn't matter much. We all know about multiplayer games that are no longer playable anymore because no one is online. Either because the game is old or because it flopped on launch and no one plays it anymore. These games are not able to come back even if a few players try to play it because the wait time to find a lobby is so high that people quit before finding a game, and that makes the wait time even longer. With async multiplayer, even if no one is online, you can still play against them. Even if a player quits the game for good and never comes back online again, their character can still be used by other players to create fun gameplay. You get the good feeling of beating other players without having the risk of the game feeling dead. This makes async multiplayer games really perfect for small teams or solo devs like me who don't have a ton of budget for powerful servers and a ton of advertisement. The second cool aspect of async multiplayer games is how there is no lag even if you have a bad internet. Since all of the data is sent at the start of the game, once the fight is started, you could lose internet completely and you could keep playing, at least for a little bit. The game is pretty much single player with other players' data. This is perfect for people with bad internet because even if you have a lot of ping, it doesn't matter. It also requires very little server power, so it doesn't cost a lot to host the servers. A server for something like an MMORPG would need a lot more power and cost a lot more. And if too many players come in the same area, it usually creates a lot of lag. Third is that since the game is not played live, you put more pressure on strategy. Live games often require you to react and think fast. But if the game is async, you can take as much time as you need for every move because there's no other player waiting for you. Also, if you don't want to be defeated, you have to set up your character in a way that it can defeat most enemies while you are away. You have to focus a lot more on strategy since you can't react to the other player. That can create a very fun game where you try to prepare for everything an enemy can do and predict every outcome possible. Then when you go offline and come back later, you can see the result of your strategy if the game lets you see which players attacked you and what the outcome was. For now, I'll keep working on this one and see if it ends up good enough for release. So feel free to subscribe if you want to see more about this game or my future ones.